I never expected to fall in love with the sound of a chainsaw, but here we are. It started 6 months ago when I decided to build a cabin on the 20 acres my grandfather left me in northern Montana. I'd been living in Seattle, working a tech job that paid well but left me feeling hollow, and after my 30th birthday passed with nothing but a grocery store cake and a video call from my parents, I knew something had to change. So I quit, sold most of my stuff, and drove east with a truck full of tools I barely knew how to use, and a dream of building something real with my own hands. The property was beautiful, all pine and aspen with a creek running through the western edge, but it was raw land with nothing but an old hunting shack that was more rust than structure. I'd watched enough YouTube videos to convince myself I could do this, but reality hit hard when I realized I needed timber, good timber, and I had no idea where to start. That's when someone at the hardware store in town mentioned Sawyer Mills, a small operation run by a guy named Finn, who apparently knew every tree in the county and could cut whatever you needed. I called the number on a faded business card, and a voice answered, deep and a little rough, like gravel wrapped in honey. We talked about board feet and moisture content and grain patterns, and I pretended to understand more than I did. He said he'd come out to look at the land, see what I was working with, maybe source some of the timber right from my property if the trees were right. When he showed up 3 days later, I was in the middle of clearing brush, covered in dirt and sweat, and completely unprepared for what stepped out of that beat-up Ford pickup. Finn was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders and forearms that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood he worked with. He wore a faded flannel with the sleeves rolled up, work pants that had seen better days, and boots that were more duct tape than leather. His hair was dark and a little too long, falling into his eyes, and he had this beard that was somewhere between rugged and wild. But it was his eyes that got me. This clear grey blue like the sky before a storm. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something shift in my chest that I wasn't ready to name. We walked the property together, and he moved through the forest like he was part of it, touching bark, looking up at canopies, occasionally pulling out a tape measure or making notes in a small weathered notebook. He'd stop at a tree and talk about it like it was an old friend, telling me about the Douglas fir that would make perfect beams, the lodgepole pine that would be ideal for framing, the way the grain in that particular aspen would catch the light if we used it for interior paneling. I found myself watching his hands more than the trees, the way his fingers traced the bark, gentle and sure. And I had to keep reminding myself to focus on what he was saying. He agreed to mill the timber from my land, said it would take a few weeks, but it would be worth it, that there was something special about building a home from the same ground it would stand on. His voice when he said that was soft, almost reverent, and I felt this weird flutter in my stomach that I told myself was just excitement about the project. He quoted me a price that was more than fair, and we shook on it, his hand rough and warm in mine, and I held on maybe a second longer than I should have. After that, Finn became a regular presence on the property. He'd show up early in the morning with his portable sawmill, this impressive contraption that he could set up in a couple hours, and he'd work through the day, turning trees into lumber with a precision that was almost artistic. I'd be working on clearing the building site or digging foundation posts, but I found myself taking more breaks than necessary, always finding reasons to walk past where he was working, watching the way his whole body moved with the rhythm of the saw, the concentration on his face, the way he'd wipe sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. We started talking more, little conversations during water breaks that stretched longer each time. He told me about growing up in timber country, learning the trade from his father, how he'd left for a while to work construction in Boise but came back because he missed the trees, missed the smell of fresh cut wood, missed the quiet of the forest. There was something in the way he talked about coming back that felt familiar, like maybe he was running from something too, or running towards something he couldn't quite name. I told him about Seattle, about the tech world, about feeling like I was living someone else's life, and he listened in a way that made me feel actually heard, nodding at the right moments, asking questions that showed he was really paying attention. One afternoon, we were stacking freshly cut boards to dry, working in that comfortable rhythm where you don't need to talk to communicate, and our hands brushed, reaching for the same piece of lumber. It was nothing, just an accidental touch. But I felt it everywhere. This electric current that ran up my arm and straight to my chest. I pulled back quickly, probably too quickly, and when I glanced at him, he was looking at me with this expression I couldn't read, something between curiosity and recognition, and I had to turn away before he could see whatever was written on my face. That night, lying in my sleeping bag in the hunting shack, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, about the way my heart had kicked up, about the fact that I'd been watching him for weeks now, with something that went way beyond appreciation for good craftsmanship. I dated women in Seattle, had a couple of relationships that fizzled out because I could never quite connect the way I was supposed to, and I'd always told myself I just hadn't met the right person yet. But lying there in the dark, listening to the wind in the pines, I had to face what I'd been avoiding, this truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. I was attracted to Finn, deeply and undeniably attracted to him. And it wasn't just physical, though God knows that was part of it. It was the way he talked about his work, the gentleness in his hands despite their roughness, the quiet competence, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, in a way I'd never managed to be. The next few weeks were a special kind of torture. I became hyper-aware of everything about him, the way he hummed while he worked, always these old country songs I half recognized, the way he'd push his hair back when he was thinking, the rare smile that transformed his whole face when I managed to say something that amused him. I started looking forward to his arrival each morning with an intensity that scared me, and I'd feel this weird disappointment on the days when weather or other jobs kept him away. I tried to convince myself it was just loneliness, just the isolation of living out here alone. But I knew I was lying to myself. We had our first real conversation about personal stuff on a Saturday afternoon when a summer storm rolled in and trapped us in the hunting shack. The rain came down in sheets, and we sat on overturned buckets drinking coffee from my thermos. And somehow we got talking about why we'd really come out here, the real reasons beyond the surface explanations. He told me about a relationship that had ended badly, about feeling like he never quite fit in anywhere, about the judgment he'd faced in a small town for being different. And I realized with a start that he was talking about a relationship with a man. He said it casually, not making a big deal of it, but watching me carefully. And I understood he was testing the waters, seeing how I'd react. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it over the rain. I told him I was sorry that had happened, that people could be cruel about things they didn't understand, and I meant it. But I also felt this surge of hope mixed with fear, this realization that maybe, possibly, there was a chance here for something I hadn't even let myself want until now. He nodded, still watching me with those storm-colored eyes, and said it was part of why he kept to himself now, why he preferred trees to people most days. They were more honest and less complicated. I laughed at that, a real laugh, and said I was starting to understand the appeal. After that day, something shifted between us. The conversation flowed easier, more honest, like we'd both decided to stop pretending to be less than we were. He started staying later, helping me with parts of the cabin construction, teaching me how to notch logs properly, how to read the wood to know where it would want to sit. We'd work side by side, and the accidental touches became more frequent. A hand steadying my shoulder when I was off balance, fingers brushing when passing tools, standing close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his body. Each touch felt deliberate now, like we were having a conversation without words, testing boundaries, asking questions neither of us was brave enough to voice out loud. The cabin was taking shape, the frame rising from the foundation like something out of a dream, and I was proud of it in a way I'd never been proud of anything in my old life. But if I'm being honest, the cabin had become almost secondary to the real construction happening, this thing building between Finn and me, fragile and terrifying and more real than anything I'd felt before. I caught myself imagining what it would be like to reach out and touch his face, to close the distance between us, to stop pretending that what I felt was just friendship or admiration or gratitude for good work. One evening in late August, we were sitting on the completed deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, sharing a six-pack of beer he'd brought, and the silence between us felt heavy, with things unsaid. I could feel him looking at me, and when I finally turned to meet his gaze, the expression on his face made my breath catch. There was want there, clear and undeniable, but also uncertainty. The same fear I was feeling, the same question about whether to take the leap or stay safe on solid ground. I don't know who moved first, whether I leaned toward him or he leaned toward me, but suddenly the space between us was closing, and then his lips were on mine, soft, despite the beard, tasting like beer and summer and possibility. The kiss was tentative at first, questioning, but when I responded, when I reached up to thread my fingers through his hair, it deepened into something that made the whole world fall away. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine and whispered that he'd been wanting to do that for months. And I laughed, shaky and relieved, and told him I'd been terrified he didn't feel the same way. We talked for hours that night, about attraction and identity and fear, about the women I'd dated while never understanding why it never felt right, about his journey to accepting himself, about what it meant to want this, to want each other, in a place where being different could still be dangerous. He was patient with my questions, with my uncertainty about labels and what this meant about who I was, telling me I didn't have to have everything figured out, that this could just be about two people who cared about each other, that the rest would come in time. The next few weeks were a revelation. Finn would stay after work and we'd cook dinner together in my camping setup. Nothing fancy, just burgers on a propane grill or pasta heated over a fire. But it felt more intimate than any restaurant meal I'd ever had. We'd talk about everything and nothing, and sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence, his hand in mine, and I'd feel this peace I'd never experienced before, like I'd finally found where I was supposed to be. The physical part was new territory for me, and I was nervous. But Finn was gentle and patient, letting me set the pace. And every touch felt like discovering a language I'd always been meant to speak. The cabin was nearly finished by September, and there was this bittersweet quality to watching it come together because I knew it meant our excuse for constant proximity was ending. I worried about what would happen when the project was done, whether this thing between us would survive without the framework of work to hold it up. But Finn must have sensed my anxiety because one morning he showed up with lumber I hadn't ordered, enough to build a small workshop. And when I asked what it was for, he said every cabin needed a proper workshop. And besides, he was thinking he might need a place to keep some tools out here if that was okay with me. The hope in his eyes when he said it made my heart ache in the best way. And I told him that would be more than okay, that I'd been hoping he'd want to stick around. We finished the cabin in early October, just as the aspens were turning gold and the air was getting that crisp bite that promised snow. The last piece was the interior paneling in the bedroom, that aspen he'd talked about on the first day. And he was right. The grain caught the light like water, like something alive. We stood back and looked at what we'd built, and I felt this overwhelming gratitude, not just for the structure, but for everything it represented. This whole journey of becoming someone I never knew I could be. That night was the first night I slept in the Finnish cabin, and Finn stayed with me. We lay in the bed we'd built together, in the room we'd constructed from trees that had grown on this land, and he held me close, his breath warm against my neck, and I felt completely at home for the first time in my life. I told him I loved him, the words surprising me even as I said them, but feeling absolutely true, and he tightened his arms around me and said he loved me too. Had probably loved me since that first day, when I'd been covered in dirt and trying so hard to look like I knew what I was doing. We've been together 6 months now, and it hasn't always been easy. Small towns talk, and we've gotten looks, lost some potential business, dealt with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from people who think their comfort is more important than our humanity. But we've also found unexpected allies, people who don't care who we love as long as we're good to each other and good to the land. Finn moved most of his stuff into the cabin last month, and we're talking about expanding his sawmill operation, maybe building a small retail space to sell custom furniture he's been designing. I think about that version of me, who drove out here 6 months ago, so lost and disconnected, convinced he was just escaping a life that didn't fit. And I wish I could tell him what was waiting out here in the woods. Not just a cabin or a new career, or even a relationship, but this whole self he didn't know existed. This capacity for love and connection and belonging that he'd been too afraid to look for. Finn didn't just cut the best timber for my cabin. He helped me build a life I actually want to live. Helped me become someone I'm proud to be. Sometimes in the morning I wake up before him and watch the light come through those aspen panels, and I listen to him breathing beside me, and I'm struck by the sheer luck of it all. How easily I could have missed this. How close I came to settling for a life that was fine but never fully mine. Building this cabin taught me that the best foundations are the ones you're willing to dig deep for, that the strongest structures come from honest materials, and that sometimes the most important thing you can construct is the courage to be exactly who you are. The cabin stands solid now, weathering its first winter, smoke rising from the chimney on cold mornings, tracks in the snow leading to the workshop where Finn spends his days turning wood into art. And I stand solid too, finally, built from the same truth and care and love that went into every board and beam. The Sawyer did cut the best timber for my cabin, but what he really gave me was so much more than lumber. He gave me a mirror to see myself clearly, a hand to hold while I figured out who that self was, and a love I didn't know I was allowed to want. And that, more than any structure of wood and stone, is the real home I built out here in these mountains.